Hi everyone. There's going to be an echo. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming to our first CPS talk of the year. We've got Haynes, who was our CPS president last year. She's going to be giving a talk called A Vegetarian Scientist. So yeah.
No, the microphone. I think it's the speaker on that one.
Nope.
I've got the speaker on the laptop. Is that better? Yep, we have no echo. Excellent. Apologies for those joining online. Just had a few technical issues to work out, as always, but thank you so much for coming to hear me talk today. It's an absolute honor to be here giving the CPS Presidential Lecture. This was traditionally supposed to be always at one of the last talks of the previous term, but due to some scheduling issues, we're having it as one of the first talks of this term. I'm really delighted to welcome in the new term and the new program of CPS Talks. It's going to be a fantastic lineup of speakers. So I hope there's some new faces in the crowd. Hope we can see you guys coming along some of the rest of the talk throughout the term. The committee worked tremendously hard putting this program together, and they do a fantastic job. So I had to think for a long time about what to talk about for my presidential lecture. We have a rather illustrious list of former presidents. If you go through some really, really famous names on there, there's a website dedicated to detailing all of the former presidents going back over 100 years. And that is pretty terrifying, trying to think what would Kathleen Lonsdale have talked about if she had a presidential lecture, for example. But even my recent CPS presidential colleagues have given some really fantastic talks on some really, really interesting subjects. And, I wanted to find a topic I could talk about that was very personal to me, but also, of course, being a scientific society, had a good basis in science that we could discuss. And I ruminated about this for a really long time. I've recently come back. I recently had my first daughter. And anyone who has children might know sometimes you have a habit of losing your hobbies a little bit when you have a child. And eventually my husband said, well, why don't you talk about being vegetarian? That's something that's really personal to you. There are some interesting bits of family history that you can talk about. And there's some good science in there as well. So this is what I've tried to pull together for you today. So a little bit about my reasons for being vegetarian, a little bit about some famous vegetarians throughout history that you might have heard of, and then a little bit of the science around some of maybe the climate-based decisions that people factors that people take into consideration when making decisions about whether to cut meat out of their diets, and a little bit about how some of the meat substitutes you might have heard of or even tried are made as well. So my aim in this talk is not to convert everyone. This is not a preachy talk, I hope. It's just my own personal take on things, and a little bit of research I've been doing over the last few months as well, in some topics that I find quite interesting. I'm going to sit down so that I can use the pointer more easily. I hope you can still see and hear me. Okay. So as it's a scientific lecture, we should really start with a definition of what vegetarian/veganism are and why some people might consider adopting these diet choices. So this is a definition published in a European Vegetarian Union position paper in 2019, and it's being adopted around Europe now as kind of a standard definition that manufacturers can use in whether or not they label their products to be vegetarian or vegan. And quite simply, vegan food products should not contain foods that are products of animal origin. That's quite a nice simple one. And then vegetarianism, by extension, is the same rules, but they can include products that have been derived from animals but didn't result in the death of an animal, essentially. So things like milk and eggs are animal products. They were not obtained by the death of an animal. And everyone has their own reasons for choosing their own choice of diet. And I came across this YouGov poll from 2021 about why people become vegan or vegetarian. So this is a personal choice everyone has to make. And so by the most common factor for being vegetarian or vegan is people just not wanting to eat animals or animal products. But after that, people not liking the way that animals are farmed and killed for food. Increasing numbers of people, I think, recently are choosing this type of diet for environmental reasons, and this is going to be a big component of the talk. People are becoming more aware of the health reasons for cutting out particularly certain types of meat from your diet. But I fall into a rather small category, interestingly enough, which is I was raised vegetarian, in this case, by my parents. Although having the opportunity to choose throughout my life, I have chosen to remain vegetarian for pretty much a combination of all of these reasons above. So vegetarianism in my family really starts with my grandfather, Norman Haynes. So he was born in 1915 in East London, and he became vegetarian at a relatively early age as a young adult. And he explained his conversion to being a vegetarian based on his interactions with another family member. So here is a Haynes family photograph, I believe from around 1940, give or take. That's me trying to age the photograph based on the date of birth of this child here. Here's young Norman Haynes. I believe he must be around 25 in this photograph. And when he was younger, Norman was often sent out to work with his uncle Clarence or Clary, shown here. I'm told Uncle Clary was a little bit like, for those who know the sitcom Only Fools Quarters, a little bit of a Del Boy character, doing lots of odd jobs, anything to make a bit of money. And one of Clary's jobs that my grandfather used to help out with was transporting animal skins from the abattoir. And this meant that my grandfather, Norman, really came face to face with the realities of what happens in an abattoir. And he decided he didn't like that very much, as you might be able to understand. And he decided that at that point he wasn't going to eat meat anymore, which was a very unusual decision for that time, for that period. In fact, Norman's mother, Marion, shown here, was very, very unhappy with her son's decision, and I'm told used to regularly try and sneak meat into her son's food because she was genuinely convinced, as many people were at the time, that it wasn't possible to survive without meat-based proteins in your diet. But Norman persevered, and he met his wife, Violet, shown next to him here. And when they got married, Vi really embraced vegetarianism as well. So they got married during the Second World War. And Violet was really very much converted. Really very much converted on the topic of vegetarianism, and for ethical reasons, but also she did an awful lot of research, reaching out to notable experts in the field, trying to understand how you could create a vegetarian diet and replace this animal protein and live a healthy lifestyle. And Norman and Vi were early members of the Vegetarian Society and other animal welfare groups. My cursor over here. So this was very much during the war years, and I was under the impression previously that being vegetarian during this era was quite an unusual thing, but actually after doing some research, I've learned that perhaps it wasn't as unusual as we might be led to believe. The Vegetarian Society had existed and had been lobbying the government for support and recognition since 1937. When food rationing was introduced during the war, the Vegetarian Society started negotiating for options to exchange the meat rations for more other types of protein like eggs, cheese, and nuts, and they secured this in 1942. And there are around 50,000 vegetarians registered for this by the end of the war. Although there was some concern that some families might be inventing vegetarian family members just to get extra rations of cheese. But back to a little bit more about my family tree. So my grandparents were adamant vegetarians, and they raised both of their sons. So Richard, this is my uncle, shown at the back of this boat here, and Greg, his younger brother, my dad, shown here. They raised both of their sons to be vegetarian, and they both remained vegetarians throughout their lives. So this is a photograph of my grandparents and my dad and a young Dr. Callie Haynes here, obviously having just enjoyed a highly nutritious vegetarian meal. And my dad, in turn, raised myself here and my sister as vegetarians as well. This is my sister Emily. I'm very pleased with myself in this photograph. I've obviously just made this jelly. I would like to point out this is vegetarian jelly set with pectin rather than gelatin. My mum, Carol, isn't a vegetarian. She never has been, but she's really embraced vegetarian cookery, cooking family meals, and even adopting some of my grandmother's recipes, including things like lentil fritters and something known as shredded wheat pie. My sister Emily was always the rebel in the family, I have to admit. She was noted, even from a very young age, about the age you can see her here, would constantly proclaim that when she grew up, she was going to be a ham, which is what she thought a meat eater was called. It was a badly kept secret that you could often find Emily under the table at family barbecues, gnawing on a chicken wing. And unsurprisingly, Emily is not a vegetarian anymore. But I've stuck it out for the reasons I described just now. And here is a photograph of the littlest sprout on our vegetarian family tree. This is my daughter Ivy, and we are currently raising her vegetarian until she's old enough to make to make an informed decision about her diet choices. Although I have to say her temperament seems to be a lot more in line with Auntie Emily than her mum, so I have a feeling which way this one's going to go. But we'll see how we go. But in terms of whether or not people can live an active and healthy lifestyle on a vegetarian diet, I think my family are living proof that this is genuinely possible. Both of my grandparents lived to a very healthy lifestyle up until a very old age, late 80s and into their 90s even. My uncle is in his 80th year, and by his own proclamation is still very healthy and active, and is very much still enjoying his vegetarian diet. So I've told you about some vegetarians who are important to me, but there are many very notable vegetarians throughout history. And I thought it would be interesting to show you some examples of very famous vegetarian scientists and tell you a bit about their beliefs and why they came to this decision. So the first over here, this is Leonardo da Vinci. And he is reported to have been very against eating animals as a source of food. And in fact, there's a report in this quote here about him going to markets and buying live birds that were intended to be eaten and then releasing them so that they could he could give them back their liberty. Ramanujan is one of the most noted mathematicians of the modern era. And he was an Orthodox Hindu and was very adamantly vegetarian. And he found it really difficult, by all reports, when he came over to study at Cambridge University during the war. His vegetarian lifestyle, coupled with his love of spicy food, meant that he really couldn't find many foods that he wanted to eat at all. And very sadly, there seems to be some reports that this might have hindered his recovery from his illness. So this is a direct quote from Nikola Tesla, who was writing in 1900 in the Century Illustrated magazine, who says, "On the general principles, the raising of cattle as a means of providing food is objectionable because it must undoubtedly tend to the addition of mass of a smaller velocity. It is certainly preferable to raise vegetables, and I think, therefore, that vegetarianism is a commendable departure from the established barbarous habit." And Albert Einstein, by his own admission, was not vegetarian for the vast majority of his life, but always sympathized with the cause. He said he'd always eaten animal flesh with a guilty conscience. He'd be prevented by outward circumstances from observing a vegetarian diet, but he supported the cause in principle. And he thought that a vegetarian manner of living, by its purely physical effect on the human temperament, would be most beneficially influence the lot of mankind. And there are many other notable vegetarians throughout history, a huge number, way more than I could fit on this slide, and I'm sure I'm missing some really important examples here. And there are various lists you can find online. And if you prefer your list of vegetarian scientists to include more characters from popular culture and be presented in periodic table form, there you go. There's the periodic table of vegan and vegetarian stars, which I'm not going to spend too much time on, but I liked the format. Thought it was worth sharing here. So, societal attitudes to meat-free diets. I have had this sung to me on many occasions by friends. You might be aware this is a clip from the TV show The Simpsons. The song is "You Don't Win Friends with Salad." And this, for a lot of my life, was a kind of an attitude I've come up against. You know, being vegetarian in my era is not the same as, you know, by a long shot as what my grandparents went through. But for a lot of my life, vegetarianism hasn't been a very popular, should we say, dietary choice. But I think that societal attitudes are definitely changing at the moment. There's a big shift in particular. And this is a poll from I think 2022 or 2023. Sorry, this is very small on my screen. It shows that generally around 14% of adults are living some sort of meat-free diet. So that's including vegan, vegetarian, and pescatarian here. So pescatarians are essentially vegetarians who also eat fish. In 2023, there are around 3.4 million vegetarians in the UK and about 1.4 million vegans. So over the last few years, you'll see that the number of people who are vegetarian, pescatarian, and vegan has pretty much remained quite consistent. We haven't seen a lot of change since about 2019. However, people have very good intentions in this area. So if you look at this infographic, you'll see that the number of people who are intending to give up meat and either take up a vegetarian or vegan diet is increasing over the years. And there's a particular generational shift here with Generation Z really being very keen on the idea of giving up meat. So I think it is definitely a growing trend for people to consider this sort of lifestyle. So being a scientist and often being around other scientists, one thing as scientists love to do is to pose questions. Really, it's our job to ask questions of our science, but also ask questions of each other. And I've been fortunate, if you can say that, to work alongside some people who found it quite entertaining to try and come up with the most challenging ethical conundrums for me about my vegetarianism that they could possibly think of. Probably my first experience of this was in an A-level biology class when my biology teacher, on hearing that I was vegetarian, decided to ask me, how do you know that bananas don't feel pain? It's a good question. This is my imagining of what bananas feeling pain would be. And my response was, I didn't think bananas could feel pain because they don't have a central nervous system, which really does kind of relate to our scientific definition of pain. And that seemed to work quite well. My teacher seemed quite impressed, and I was pretty pleased with that. So I stuck with that as my definition of what I could and couldn't eat for some years. So I decided to focus on not causing harm. And in order to not cause harm, I decided I wasn't going to eat anything with a central nervous system. But fast forward to my PhD years, and my lab mates thought it would be very entertaining to try and find the exceptions for my rule. So I got asked a variety of questions, including, here are some of the lab mates. I apologize for the quality of the photograph. Camera phones that long ago were not what they are now. Can vegetarians eat jellyfish, for example? Now, this surprisingly, my recent research has found was actually the subject of an article in The Guardian. And as this Guardian article points out, jellyfish are devoid of any brain or nervous system, and a lot of them can't even control where they move. So can they really be said to feel pain? I think my response to this is something along the lines of the response in this first paragraph. I would paraphrase. This might not be the phrasing that I would use. I would say perhaps I might not want to eat jellyfish rather than whether or not I should eat jellyfish. I think my choice would just be that I didn't really want to eat jellyfish. But there are more questions. Can vegetarians eat coral on the same reasoning? Can vegetarians eat plankton? Actually, some chefs are now starting to experiment with cooking with plankton, although phytoplankton, so plant-based planktons rather than animal planktons, zooplankton, which is what things like whales eat. But yes, I think vegetarians actually can eat plankton. Can vegetarians eat shed lizard tails or snake skins, so parts of animals that have been removed without killing the animal? Can vegetarians eat meat-flavored crisps? So you can see we're deteriorating a little bit in the quality of the questions. The general trend was towards people asking me annoying questions. And so I decided I needed to be a bit more specific to cut out these questions and decide I was only going to eat things that weren't formally alive, and whether or not I had to consider whether or not the cells had a cell wall, because a common feature of plant and fungal cells is that they have a cell wall made of cellulose or chitosan, whereas animal cells just have a cell membrane. And this is not a definition that really correlates well with my reasons for being vegetarian, but it is at least a nice definition that's harder to argue with. So meat substitutes. These have been an increasing part of my diet personally, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room have eaten some meat substitutes over the years. Again, societal attitudes to these seems to be shifting. Another Guardian article from 2018 was a bit scathing about them, saying some people will eat almost anything as long as no animals were involved in its creation, but that proposition appeals less to those who prefer to base their meals on natural, minimally processed ingredients that they can easily recognize as food. Here is a clip from an American TV show called Parks and Recreation, and this is a character called Ron Swanson sampling, in inverted commas, some vegan bacon, and by sampling he means to put it directly into the bin. And detractors of meat substitutes will always complain on one of two grounds. Number one, that a meat substitute is not meat, but also number two, that a meat substitute is not recognizably a vegetable either. So meat substitutes get some bad press for being a little bit stuck in the middle, but I do think they have a very valuable role to play, especially in helping people to replace meat from their diet should they be choosing to try and give it up. But they're also not a new technology, right? So certain meat substitutes have been, have been eaten by humans for centuries. There's things like jackfruit, which have been gaining popularity again in Western cuisine today, and tofu and tempeh have been known for since 1,000 years BC. And this is actually an illustration of a tofu salad here from a poetry anthology published in around 1500. So just to make everyone aware that I'm going to talk now about some newer meat substitutes and the science behind their creation, but actually meat substitutes have been known for centuries. So one of the first meat substitutes I came across in my childhood was corn. And it was invented in the 1960s by a team led by Lord Joseph Arthur Rank, who was the chairman of a company called Rank Hovis McDougall. So this science really followed on from the industrial production of baker's yeast in the early 1900s. And yeast biomass was actually used as human food in Germany during World War I. But this ongoing search for artificial protein sources in the 60s was prompted by fears that the supply of food was rapidly being exceeded by global population growth. So there's fear that we would run out of animal sources of protein. We would need to find some easily accessible, edible protein from other sources. And Rank's team screened over 3,000 soil samples from around the world looking for a fungus that could produce edible protein, essentially. And they discovered a fungus called Fusarium venetatum. I believe I probably said that wrong. Latin's not my strong point. So this was a joint venture on everywhere by Rank Hovis McDougall and Imperial Chemical Industries. So as you can see, the chemical industry. Chemical industries have played a huge part in the development of meat substitutes over the years. So corn was officially launched as an edible meat substitute in the UK in 1985. It was owned by AstraZeneca between 1993 and 2003, and it's currently owned by Monday Nissan. And a little bit about the process by which this fungus was identified and the process was developed. So more than 3,000 fungi were collected from soil samples all over the world. And the screening criteria they were looking for was fast growth in culture. They wanted filamentous growth for the later processing. They didn't want any pigments or odor or anything that would be off-putting for people who were going to eat it. They wanted the ability to use inorganic nitrogen sources, so ammonia, essentially, for building into proteins and amino acids. No toxins, of course, and content of more than 45% protein. The drive here is really the creation of edible protein. So selected 20 strains and narrowed it down, and they conducted a lot of feeding trials with animals. And funnily enough, the strain they actually settled on was isolated from an employee's back garden right near the production plant. So even though they screened samples from all over the world, the most effective fungus was a very local one. Here is a little bit of an overview from corn about how they make corn. It's produced from this fungus by essentially a fermentation process. If you flip forward, here's a diagram I dug out of a book of the fermenter, and I can't claim to be an expert in fermentation, but apparently this is a continuous flow culture system. So the riser contains a two-phase mixture of air and culture flowing together, so that air bubbles contribute up to 50% of the volume of the culture fluid, and this promotes oxygen transfer, essentially, between the fluid and the air bubbles. The carbon dioxide is continuously extracted at the top, and nitrogen supply, like I said before, is ammonia. This is fed in at the bottom. And initially, the harvested protein can't actually be used as a food source initially because it contains high level of RNA. Okay, so RNA is harmful to humans because in humans, RNA is broken down into nucleic acids and then further into uric acid, and that causes illnesses like gout. So RNA needs to be removed. This is done by heating it up to 68 degrees, and this activates native RNase enzymes, which breaks down the RNA and makes it safe to eat. And usefully, it also denatures the protease enzymes in the sample, which means that the proteins can't be degraded anymore by the enzymes in the sample. So in this heating step, they are able to get rid of the RNA, which could cause conditions like gout, and also to protect the protein against decomposition by native enzymes. But more recently, there have been some new and exciting meat substitutes being launched. You might have come across some of these. So I don't know if anyone has ever eaten a Beyond burger. Here's a picture of one here. So this was released in 2012 in the US. I think it's a bit more of a recent release over here, but you can definitely get them here now. And Beyond's focus has been really on closely replicating the texture of meat. Okay, so their goal was to create a plant-based protein that has the same three-dimensional protein network as an animal tissue, because that network is what traps all of the components of meat that you want to replicate in a food, such as water, carbohydrates, fats, and flavors. And the way they've done this is to take pea protein, they form this into a dough, and then they use extrusion, which is essentially applying pressure and shear forces to produce a fibrous network within the protein. It can be set into different shapes by cooling. What another factor I thought was interesting is the color they add to Beyond Meat is extracted from beetroot. It's a pigment, and one feature of this is the pigment denatures when you heat it up, which leads the red meat substitute to go from red to brown as you cook it, which I guess is a nice touch for anyone looking for some realism in their meat substitutes. You might also have come across the so-called Impossible Burger. This is an Impossible Burger here. And this, again, is a new member of the meat substitute family. So this is much newer. It was released in the US in 2016 and really has only been available in the UK since 2022. And Impossible's focus was to replicate the flavor of red meat. And they really highlighted the role of hemoglobin in this. So hemoglobin is the oxygen-carrying molecule that's found in red blood cells, apparently. So you can see there's a very strong link between blood and red meat. So replicating that might be thought of as a bit of a challenge, but they have identified another very similar molecule known as legume hemoglobin, or shortened to legumeglobin, I assume. It's actually more similar to myoglobin found in muscle cells. But again, it is an oxygen-binding protein that contains ferrous heme. And they found that this has a very similar flavor to the heme protein that's derived from hemoglobin, or so they claim. And so this protein was initially isolated from soy roots, but it's now produced by fermentation. And this is what's added into the Impossible meat substitutes to give it that meaty flavor and also color. But these meat substitutes haven't been without their controversy. Particularly, I mean, corn oil was originally marketed as a mushroom-based product, which got them into some hot water because technically it's a microfungus, not a mushroom. Particularly from the American Mushroom Institute were very upset about this. And Impossible meats have had some controversy because the legume hemoglobin needed animal testing in order to get FDA approval, so that didn't sit very well with a lot of vegetarians and vegans. They have to be labeled as genetically modified because they use genetically engineered yeast to produce the legume hemoglobin as well, which again is not always a popular choice societally. And there's also the criticism that meat substitutes are very highly processed. So are they actually really green alternatives? Now that we know that a lot of vegetarians and vegans are making their choices based on environmental factors, are they really green alternatives? So you might be familiar with this type of graphic, looking at the energy efficiency of a vegetarian versus a meat-based diet. This is a very simple argument. The idea that you can grow, let's say, a field full of crops, and that field full of crops can feed maybe 100 people, or it can feed a cow throughout its lifetime, and that cow will then feed 10 people. So the energy efficiency, this isn't an exact science here. You can see this is actually a bit simple. I got this graphic from a GCSE biology website. But the point is essentially that it's a lot more energy intensive to produce meat-based foods than it is to produce plant-based foods. And if you look at the numbers, the greenhouse, down here I'm looking at the greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food products, okay? And this is in carbon dioxide equivalents. So there are some gases like methane, for example, which have a much more detrimental global warming effect. And this is essentially weighted. In fact, I believe methane is 80 times more harmful in terms of global warming than carbon dioxide. And you can see definitely that the meat sources, particularly beef, have a very huge impact on global warming. Interestingly, cheese is vegetarian, but is also a byproduct of the cow farming industry, and therefore has a relatively high greenhouse gas impact, higher than, for example, pig meat and poultry meat. And then as we come down into these more plant-based products, proteins, you'll see the carbon footprint is indeed a lot lower. So this is a paper, this was taken from a paper published in 2018 in which the scientists tried to estimate the effect of the world's diet choices on global land use. So they tried to estimate what the effect on global land use for agriculture would be if the entire population of the world changed their dietary habits. So you can see at the time there was 4.13 billion hectares being used for pasture and cropland combined. And then they estimated what the effect of everyone adopting a diet including no beef or mutton, no beef, mutton or dairy, no red meat, dairy or poultry, and a vegan diet. And the upshot was they estimated that if everyone ate a vegan diet, we would reduce the amount of land we use for agriculture by 75%. And for context, that's an area of land the size of North America plus Brazil. So this is a huge amount of land that we're currently using for agriculture that would be reduced if everyone in the entire world were to adopt a strict vegan diet. But there are other huge factors that contribute to the carbon footprint of our food. A big one is food waste. So even low carbon footprint foods contribute more significantly to global warming if they are wasted. Okay, so when food breaks down in a low oxygen environment, it produces methane. And as I just mentioned, methane is one of the most harmful greenhouse gases. So this is just a graphic from a BBC article showing this is the emissions in carbon dioxide equivalents from eating one portion of bean and vegetable stir fry as a relatively simple vegetarian meal. The carbon footprint of is almost double if you just waste 3 parsnips, 2 broccoli, and 1 orange. Okay, if you throw that away and it decomposes in anaerobic conditions to produce methane, there's a much higher carbon footprint. So while cutting meat out of your diet might be one way to reduce your carbon footprint, another really important factor is reducing food waste. So I asked the question of whether meat substitutes were really a greener alternative because they are not picked directly out of the ground. There is processing, and processing is energy intensive. And how does that affect their carbon footprint? So here is a table of some carbon footprints of various protein sources, including beef and some meat substitutes. So this is, I think, derived from an American publication. So some of these you might not have come across, but I think quite a nice comparison is from here. So here is a Beyond Burger, one of the ones we talked about before. And as you can see, the Beyond meat had a significantly lower carbon footprint compared to beef, as you might expect. But as we discussed, Beyond meat is derived from pea proteins, right? So you can see it has a significantly larger carbon footprint than peas. So, you know, I think for me, it's a bit of a balance, isn't it? You know, it very much depends on the comparisons you draw, and whether many people would live on a diet of peas is debatable, whether there's still maybe some way to go here. So public opinion of meat substitutes. Do people think they're actually any good? And I suppose this poll is maybe not asking about whether or not the people like the meat substitutes, or actually whether they think they are a good mimic of the meats they're trying to replicate. And you might not be surprised to hear that chicken seems to be one of the most successful or the easiest meats to replicate, whereas beef, bacon especially seems to be one of the ones where people don't seem to think that the bacon alternatives come very close to the real thing. So what next? We've got all of these lovely meat substitutes, but what's on the horizon? And something you might have come across that's currently very much at a developmental stage is lab-grown meat or cultured meat. So this is meat tissues that have been developed, have been grown purely in a laboratory, right? So there has been essentially no animal involved. You haven't had to rear and then slaughter an animal to produce this meat tissue for human consumption. So growing tissues in vivo isn't really new technology. In fact, it's been studied for decades for medical applications, so regenerative medicine and transplants. And in fact, in 2022, there was the first clinical trial in humans of red blood cells that had been grown in a laboratory. So a person received a blood transfusion of lab-grown red blood cells. So that shows that we are getting pretty good at replicating animal tissues and cells in the lab. And even as early as the 2000s, NASA was funding research into growing goldfish muscle as a potential source of protein for astronauts, although I don't believe that was continued. This is now a rapidly expanding sector with hundreds of millions of dollars of investment just in the last 10 years alone. And an estimate from this paper here suggested that 35% of all meat consumed globally could be cultured by 2040. And as I said before, the advantages here, or the potential here, rather, I should say, is that there is no farming required, so we don't get the environmental impact of farming. And also there's theoretically no animal slaughter involved. So the animal welfare considerations of vegetarian and veganism could also be counted here. So we're making some progress on this front. The first cultured meat burger was produced in 2013 in the Netherlands from primary cow skeletal muscle cells. The burger was fried as a kind of a demonstration at a conference, and the overall process cost 250,000 euros. So that's quite a pricey burger. There is that burger as a photograph. And one of the reasons it costs so much to produce was this is essentially how this tissue is produced. It's produced in thousands and thousands of tissue plates, as you can see here. And culturing and growing all of these under controlled conditions is tremendously energy and cost intensive. But the technology is coming along. And in 2020, an American company called Eat Just got approval to sell cultured chicken meat in Singapore. And there is one restaurant in Singapore now where you can order and eat lab-grown chicken nuggets, as you can see here. And the FDA in the USA classified cultured meat as safe to eat in 2022. So there is progress towards this actually being used as a food source. Now, I have a video that I was going to play, and I don't know whether the sound is going to come out if I play it online. I will give it a go, and I apologize to anyone watching online if this does not work. Oh, it doesn't seem to want to play. Hang on, let's turn the pointer off. Okay, I've lost my cursor as well. No, it doesn't seem to want to let me play my video. I apologize. Look it up. There's quite an interesting video here available on YouTube and also via CNET. What this shows is some technology that's being developed where you can 3D print a steak. Okay, so there's a user interface with a touch screen, and you can select details like how much, what the ratio of fat to muscle tissue you want in your steak is, and then it 3D prints it in front of your eyes. Unfortunately, this technology at this point requires you then to go and stick your printed steak in an incubator for a couple of weeks because the cells need to grow into tissues and before you can eat them. But this is being marketed as the future of lab-grown meat. You'll be able to print your cells into the exact meat product that you want, and then have your designer steak. But there's a lot of challenges still to be overcome before this is an everyday technology, right? So the reality is that few companies can produce lab cultured meat for a meal that costs less than $100. In 2019, Eat Just claimed that they brought the cost of a single chicken nugget down to $50, and this is considered a big achievement in this field. It had previously been over $1,000 to produce a single chicken nugget, but they are making a loss on the chicken nuggets that they serve in their restaurant in Singapore. Right, so this is just the initial phase where they're trying to gain recognition for their product, but they are not making a profit on their product. Scale up is a big challenge here. Okay, so the technology being used in this industry is inspired by the biopharma industry, and it's more commonly used for things like making viral vaccines. The acceptable cost of a medical product such as a vaccine is much higher than the cost you might be prepared to pay for a burger. And one of the big reasons for this is the reliance of the industry on fetal bovine serum. So this is used as a medium for the growth of cells and tissues. There's a lot of work being put into trying to replace this with cheaper and more ethical alternatives, but nothing really seems to work as well, according to the sources that I've read. It is also derived from the meat industry. So whether or not this is truly a cruelty-free alternative at this point is controversial. It's also very expensive, and there isn't currently any viable alternatives that have been widely adopted. So, is cultured meat veggie or vegan friendly? There are some positives, right? So it could, in theory, significantly reduce carbon emissions. If we can produce meat products without the need for farming and agriculture, then we could significantly reduce carbon emissions. It's a source of meat that causes much less harm to animals. Whether there is zero harm is debatable. But it is still animal derived. You know, these tissues are still derived from stem cells which have been harvested from animals. And as I said before, the reliance on fetal bovine serum is also still a drawback. And it still reinforces really the idea that animals are a source of food. And it raises new ethical questions, ones that I haven't come across before. Should we assert the rights of a single cow not to have its stem cells harvested above the rights of all the animals who could be not slaughtered in order so we can get the burgers from that cell? So do the rights of one cow not to have its cells harvested outweigh the rights of all of the other cows not to be slaughtered? And I think that's an interesting discussion for the future. Do people think that cultured meat is vegetarian or vegan friendly? We come back to another YouGov poll, this time from 2021. Quite a lot. I was surprised to see quite how many vegans and vegetarians seem to be quite in favor of eating lab-grown meats, actually. So about 30% of vegans and 27% of vegetarians thought it would be fine for vegetarians and vegans to eat lab-grown meats. I think it really is a personal choice. But as to whether it's currently a green alternative, here's an extended version of the graphic I showed you before, showing also now the global warming potential, another relative measure of the emissions, global warming emissions produced by different types of food source. And down the bottom, we have things like jackfruit, and then some slightly processed alternatives like tofu and seitan. Cheeses come a bit higher, up to 9.1 here, because of the reliance on milk, of course. And up here, we have cultured meat, which still has a very high global warming potential. So although this technology has the potential to cut the carbon footprint of our food, it's still a very high, it's not the best alternative at the moment. And then finally, I had a look at this paper published in Nature in 2018, in which they were looking at the planetary boundary framework, which is essentially a framework that tries to define a safe operating space for humanity. Okay, so looking at how the impact of our actions might push us beyond certain boundaries, which would run the risk of destabilizing our ecosystem. And they concluded that in order to stay within the planetary boundaries of our food system, we need to make some changes, and different changes are recommended to combat different environmental stresses. So to cut greenhouse gas emissions, they cannot be sufficiently mitigated without dietary changes towards more plant-based diets. But cropland and blue water use are best addressed by improvements in technology and closing the yield gaps and increasing water use efficiency. And reducing nitrogen and phosphorus can only be achieved by a combination of methods, including dietary change. And finally, I did a little bit of research today. I popped over to the UCL canteen to very important research I did at lunchtime today to check out their vegetarian and plant-based meal options. And I was actually pretty impressed. So UCL have won awards for their plant-based menu. All of our food comes with a high carbon, medium carbon, or low carbon warning on the menu before you order it. This was my choice today. And we've signed up to this plant-based university scheme. And all of our hospitality choices are by default vegetarian and vegan. So UCL are making significant steps towards trying to encourage a plant-based and vegetarian and vegan diet. Meat products are not banned at UCL. We are allowed to eat meat if you so choose, but as an institution, we are making the drive towards trying to encourage these alternatives. So thank you for listening. I'd like to finish with some acknowledgements. First of all, a big thank you to the CPS and the SCI. I've had a tremendous time being involved with the CPS for the last 2 years. I'd particularly like to also thank last year's committee and JL and Crescio. I'm not 100% sure, but I may have been the first sitting president to take maternity leave during her term. I was very well. I was okay. Thank you, Sally. So I was really very lucky to be supported by J. Alan Cresho, who doubled back down. Even after finishing his presidential term, came back to support even more while I was away. I'd like to thank all my family and friends who have inspired, supported, encouraged, and interrogated, and particularly some family members who gave me a family history lesson. My uncle Richard, my dad's cousin Norman, and my other dad's cousin Annie for giving me the photographs and informing me about our family history, which is really, to me, very interesting at least. And also to Alvaro, who gave me a fantastic article that he'd written himself about cultured meat, and really set me off on quite a lot of research into this technology as well. And finally, to my daughter, who this was a little video you might have just seen of her stealing food directly out of my hand that I was eating, and I hope that she'll continue to be interested in her mum's food choices for many years to come. And thank you.
If anyone has any questions, now would be a really nice time to ask. Yeah.
You pointed how you warm up, how you cook, cater for yourself, other things. It's very much in your family upbringing. And part of mine, my mother, was that you need a diversity of proteins for health. It's not just you do need to have the protein in your diets, and you've got fewer options there, but the variety aspect. How much has this been addressed in the health issue of diversity of proteins?
Absolutely, I do think diversity is really important. I remember reading for a long time that, and I'm not sure if it's regarded as true anymore, but that there was no single vegetable protein source that provided all 20 essential amino acids. Essentially, so if you eat an animal protein, it contains all of the essential amino acids because our tissues are so similar to our own. It contains everything that we need, whereas you have to especially be careful to diversify your protein sources to get all of the essential amino acids. To be honest, I'm not sure to what extent the various technologies are addressing this, but I would also suggest maybe not a lot of people are choosing to live primarily or only on a single protein source. I think you're absolutely right. Diversity is key. And there are also other kind of essential components of diet that are very hard to get hold of in a vegetarian diet. And if you're not aware of that, it can cause issues. I think vitamin B12 is a particular one. Marmite is great for that, by the way. And certain essential fats as well can be hard to come by in a vegetarian diet. But it's all, I think it's all about people can do their research, and indeed my grandmother was doing that back in the 1940s. So there are possibilities out there now, and it's significantly easier than it used to be. That's a good thing.
They did say that people were actually healthier during the war on the very restricted diet allowed by the coupons.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel fantastically lucky to have so many food options now, but whether I always make the healthiest choices or not, I couldn't possibly comment. But I'm sure my grandparents were much healthier than I am.
Follow a comment from that. I think that point was addressed in part, at least, by Simon Branch last term's joint SCI CPS lecture. Some of you will have attended. Anyway, in video, but it is. Look at that.
Fantastic.
That's the point about the amino acids in the protein. The question is, and I appreciate that we've had plenty of materials to fill the time allowed you, but given the title, especially your title, your lecture, then what about vivisection? Sorry, that's not a question correctly framed, but we did mention during your talk about the FDA insisting on certain food material being tested on animals.
Yeah.
Well, that's I've registered myself. Okay, that seems to me absolutely indefensible. If people want something as in our species, I don't care what it is, then you don't try it out on other species.
Yeah.
You want it, you eat it.
Mm-hmm.
You die, you die. Okay? But you don't best fair of animal species?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really difficult one, honestly. For those who couldn't hear online, sorry, the question was about animal testing and the ethics of animal testing, and whether we as a species should be essentially exploiting animals for the development of products, such as food products, but also I guess medicines, cosmetics. You know, so many products are tested on animals. I put my personal view, or what I can give is my personal viewpoint. I don't like the idea of using animal testing for what I would describe as luxury products, right? Things we can live without. I think for me personally, it's a different discussion as to whether animal testing is acceptable in the development of medicines, and in foods and cosmetics. So medicines save lives. At present, the foods and the cosmetics are what I would describe as luxuries, and therefore I'm less comfortable with it. But it's a very difficult discussion, a very difficult topic, and there's really strong points to be made on both sides. I think, but that's just my personal take.
Just follow on. Do you happen to know what the position is in this country with regard to launching food products?
Actually, I don't. The Impossible Meat was launched later in the UK than the US, but I imagine that's simply because the product was developed in the US and that was their primary market. So I don't know what the position was, and whether we have a higher level of restriction, or if what they performed in order to gain access to the American market was sufficient for UK marketing.
It would be interesting to know.
Yeah, it would be. It would be.
Yeah.
I wonder if there are any comments or things people from different cultures on the food aspects. This is a bit of an issue for science travelling. I can remember in science conference, we're meeting up with a colleague that I've been to a lot of conferences with from India, who has therefore a vegetarian diet. And in Poland, it was very difficult to get any food at all. It was such a foreign cultural idea. You had to be requesting separately complex makes.
Yeah, absolutely,
like
absolutely. I mean, I do think that. I think in recent years, it's become, even globally, the vegetarianism doesn't seem to be becoming more widespread. I mean, in Europe at least. I haven't traveled so widely as some of my colleagues, but I've certainly had that experience. In Poland, actually, I attended a summer school during my PhD, 2 weeks in one place in Poland, and they tried, the catering staff tried really, really hard. But in the end, they gave up trying to cook me savory food and just served me dessert as a main course for at least a week. And I got very popular by giving it away to everyone when I couldn't finish it all. But no, it can be tremendously challenging abroad. And even in my childhood, traveling very short distances just to Europe, finding very limited options of what you can eat, and just eating the same food every single night, because you find one meal that you can eat and is safe, and people will make without too much question, and so you stick with that. But I think things are getting better, definitely.
Just want to say thank you everyone for coming to the talk, and thank you, Callie, for such a very insightful and thought-provoking talk. Just as a thank you from the entire CPS team for Callie for being such an amazing president for us this year. We've got some presents for you.
Oh, thank you so much. I think I saw JL sneaking in the back at some point, but just to say that I know that I'm leaving the CPS in very good hands, and I'm delighted to hand over formally to your term as president. Okay, thanks very much.